I found the GPS tracker on a Tuesday morning in late October, wedged up behind the rear axle of my truck like it belonged there. I'd been lying on the cold garage floor, trying to find where the exhaust was rattling. The kind of thing you do yourself when you're 69 years old, and you've been fixing your own vehicles since before your son was born. My fingers found it before my eyes did. A small rectangular device, matte black, about the size of a deck of cards, held in place with two strong magnets. I pulled it loose and lay there on the concrete for a moment, holding it above my face, staring at it. I knew what it was. You don't spend 34 years as a claims investigator for one of the largest insurance companies in Ontario without learning to recognize surveillance equipment. The question wasn't what it was. The question was who put it there. And why. Before I tell you what I found out, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this from? What time is it there right now? I've learned over the past year that these stories travel further than you'd expect. Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. My name isn't important. What happened to me is, I live on 14 acres outside of Guelph. Good land, well drained, with a barn I converted into a woodworking shop after I retired 6 years ago. My late wife, Lorraine, and I bought the property in 1991, when our son was 3 years old, and our daughter was just born. We had plans for this place. Horses, eventually. A market garden. All the things you tell yourself you'll do when you finally have space. Lorraine died of a stroke in 2019, 61 years old. No warning. I came home from a hardware run and she was on the kitchen floor. We'd been married 37 years. After that, the property felt very large. My son, I'll call him by his name, because he's earned it. His name is Curtis. He's 42 now. He moved back to Ontario from Calgary about 18 months before all of this happened. Said the oil industry had dried up, said he needed a fresh start, said he missed being close to family. I was glad to have him nearby. More than glad. I'd rattled around this house alone for 2 years by then. Curtis started coming by on weekends, helping with things around the property, borrowing tools, staying for dinner. He brought his partner, a woman named Heather who worked in pharmaceutical sales. They seemed happy. I liked her well enough, though she had a habit of studying a room when she walked into it that I only recognized later for what it was. The tracker went into my jacket pocket. I finished checking the exhaust. Nothing serious. A loose heat shield washed my hands, and went inside to think. My background meant I knew the first rule of this kind of thing. You don't react. You don't confront. You don't change your behavior. You gather information until you have enough to understand the full picture. Reacting early is how cases fall apart. I'd seen it dozens of times from the other side of a desk. I set the device on my kitchen table and looked at it over a cup of coffee. Curtis had been in my garage 3 weeks earlier, helping me swap the winter tires. He'd been back there alone for maybe 20 minutes while I brought out the jack stands. Heather had stayed in the kitchen, chatting with me, asking about my health, asking if I'd had my annual physical, asking whether my doctor had said anything about my memory. I thought it was just concern at the time. Now I looked at that tracker and thought about all the questions they'd asked me over the past several months. Curtis wanting to know if I still drove to Toronto sometimes. Heather asking whether I ever felt confused on the highway. Curtis suggesting maybe I should think about moving into something smaller, easier to manage. More than once he'd said, casually, the way you'd mentioned the weather, that a neighbor down the road had sold his acreage to a developer for just under $2 million. I'm not a man who cries easily. Lorraine used to tease me about it. She said I'd kept a straight face at our own wedding. But sitting there at that kitchen table, holding that tracker in my hands, my eyes burned. I put it back exactly where I'd found it. The following Monday, I drove to Guelph and used the computer terminal at the Wellington County Public Library. I'd left my phone at home. 34 years in insurance fraud taught me that if someone is tracking your vehicle, they may be tracking more than that. I logged into my bank accounts for the first time in several months. I handled most things by paper statement. Old habit. But something Heather had said a few weeks earlier had been sitting at the back of my mind. She'd mentioned, very gently, that paper statements were so easy to lose that she could help me set up online access if I wanted. I should have had roughly $380,000 in my savings account. The balance was $241,000. My chest went tight in a way I hadn't felt since I'd found Lorraine on the floor. I sat there in that library and went through every transaction. Wire transfer, Wire transfer. Wire transfer. Always to the same recipient. Thornfield Asset Management. Transfers ranging from $12,000 to $35,000 at a time, going back almost 5 months. I had never heard of Thornfield Asset Management. I had never authorized a single one of these transfers. I searched the company name. No website, no listing with the Ontario Business Registry, a name on paper, and nothing else. I knew exactly what that meant. I wrote everything down by hand in a notebook I'd bought that morning and paid for with cash. Then I drove to the OPP detachment on Stone Road. The officer I spoke with was a constable named Yip, maybe 30 years old, patient, methodical. She took notes. She asked good questions. Then she said what I expected her to say. Without evidence directly connecting a named individual to those transfers, there wasn't yet a criminal case to build. It could be identity theft. It could be a banking error. The GPS tracker was concerning, but not, on its own, proof of anything. She gave me a name. A woman in Hamilton who specialized in financial elder abuse cases. She'd worked 15 years with the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit before going private. The constable wrote the number on a card and slid it across the desk. Document everything, she said, and be careful. These situations tend to escalate once the target begins asking questions. I thanked her and left. The word escalate followed me home. I called the investigator the next morning from the payphone outside the Canadian Tire on Woodlawn. Her name was Beverly Park. I'd done enough parallel work over my career to know her reputation. She was thorough, she was fast, and she didn't waste words. We met 2 days later at a diner in Fergus, far enough from Guelph that the chance of running into anyone I knew was minimal. Beverly was in her early 60s, the kind of person who made you feel like you were being professionally assessed within 30 seconds of shaking her hand. I appreciated that. I'd been that person for most of my working life. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she ordered a refill on her coffee and said, "This follows a pattern. I've worked 11 times in the past 3 years. Adult children, sometimes with a partner involved. They begin with information gathering. They need to understand your routines, your assets, your cognitive state. The vehicle tracker gives them movement patterns. It also tells them when you're away from the property. When you're away from the property." I thought about the times Curtis had been at my house without me there. He had a key. I'd given it to him myself 8 months ago, because he'd offered to check on things when I went up to visit my sister in Sudbury. Beverly continued. The financial transfers suggest they already have access to your banking credentials. Do you keep account information written down anywhere at home? I did, in a small notebook in my desk drawer. Lorraine had insisted on it. She'd had an aunt who kept everything in her head, and when the aunt got sick, there was chaos sorting out her estate. So we'd always kept a written record. Passwords, account numbers, security questions. The notebook was in my desk drawer. Curtis had been in my office twice that I could remember. Once to use the printer, once to help me move a bookshelf. Both times he'd been in there alone for a few minutes. A few minutes is enough. I need you to do something difficult, Beverly said. I need you to keep acting exactly as you have been. Don't change the locks. Don't move the money yet. Don't confront anyone. Give me 2 weeks to trace where those funds actually went. 2 weeks of sitting in that house, knowing what I knew. 2 weeks of Sunday dinners with my son. I said yes. The following Sunday, Curtis arrived with Heather and a pot of his mother's chili recipe. He'd asked me for it 3 months after Lorraine died. Said he wanted to keep making it. I'd given it to him without hesitation. Now, I watched him move through my kitchen with the ease of someone who had already decided this place was his and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. Heather asked about my sleep. She asked whether I'd been feeling any more confusion than usual. She asked, gently, and with a look of practiced concern, whether my doctor had ever suggested a memory screening. Not that I recall, I said. She laughed like I'd made a joke, but her eyes didn't change. After dinner, Curtis walked out to the barn with me, the way he used to when he was a boy. We stood in the doorway looking out at the back field in the early dark. For a moment he was 8 years old again, and asking me how combine harvesters worked. Dad, he said, I've been thinking. This property is a lot to manage at your age. You've said yourself you're not sure about another winter out here alone. I'd said no such thing. I looked at him. He was staring at the field. There's a really good retirement community near Waterloo. Heather's been in touch with someone there. Independent living. You'd have your own unit, workshop space even. You could still do your woodworking, and you wouldn't have to worry about the upkeep. What would happen to the land? He turned to look at me then. His expression was careful, measured, the face of a man who has rehearsed this conversation. We'd handle all of that, so you wouldn't have to stress about it. I nodded slowly. That sounds like something to think about. He relaxed. Just slightly, just enough for me to see it. After their car turned out of the driveway, I sat in my shop for an hour with the lights off. Lorraine and I had built something here, not just the property something, a life. I thought about the year we planted the apple trees along the back fence. The two of us out there in the mud arguing about spacing, neither of us knowing what we were doing, and then standing back and looking at the crooked little row, and laughing until we couldn't breathe. Those trees were still there, still producing. Curtis wanted to hand them to a developer so he could access my savings. I walked back inside and I said to the empty kitchen, "Not a chance." Beverly called 11 days later. Thornfield Asset Management, she said, was incorporated in British Columbia 14 months ago. The sole director of record was a numbered company, but the registered agent was a law office in Calgary, the same city Curtis had supposedly left because the work had dried up. I traced the funds through 2 intermediate accounts, she continued. They land in a personal account at a credit union in Hamilton. The account holder's name is Heather Mercer. Heather, his partner. She's been with him long enough for this to have been planned before he moved back to Ontario, I said. That's my read as well. Beverly had more. She'd pulled land registry records. A purchase offer had been submitted on my property 6 weeks earlier, not by Curtis or Heather directly, but by a numbered Ontario company that had been incorporated 4 months ago. The offer had been submitted to a real estate agent in Guelph. The agent had apparently been told the property owner was actively looking to sell and had authorized a representative to handle negotiations. I had done no such thing. The representative listed on the offer documents, Beverly said, was acting under a power of attorney. An enduring power of attorney for property, filed with the court 11 weeks ago, authorizing Curtis to act on my behalf in all financial and property matters. I have never signed a power of attorney. I know, Beverly said. I've requested the filed copy. The signature doesn't match your current samples. I believe they traced it from the property deed. Your name is on it clearly, and Curtis would have had access to it. There was a pause on the line. There's one more thing. Tell me. I pulled call records. Curtis has made 6 calls in the past 3 weeks to a private assessment clinic in Mississauga. The clinic specializes in cognitive capacity evaluations. He's scheduled an appointment for you. The intake form lists you as the patient. It's in 9 days. I understood immediately. If a doctor assessed me and documented signs of diminished capacity, it would support the power of attorney claim. It would make everything they'd already done look like reasonable, protective action taken by a worried son. Beverly, I said, how fast can you put together a package for the OPP? Give me 48 hours. I'll be at the detachment in 48 hours. We were there in 46. Beverly's documentation was meticulous. The trace transfers, the shell company, the forged POA filing, the land offer, the clinic booking, the kind of case file that closes doors. The investigators at the Serious Fraud Office took it from there. They coordinated with the OPP detachment. They verified the forgery with a document examiner. They confirmed the Thornfield account was in Heather's name. They obtained warrants. They asked me to go home and act normal for 2 more days. I have never found those 2 days harder than anything in 34 years of claims work. On the second evening, Curtis called. Just checking in, he said. Wanted to see how I was doing. Asked again about the appointment he'd supposedly scheduled, framed it as something he'd heard about from a friend, a specialist, maybe worth looking into. Very casual, very warm. I told him I'd think about it. After I hung up, I sat in the dark in Lorraine's chair, the one by the east window where she used to read, and I talked to her. I do that sometimes. I told her what was happening. I told her I was angry, and I was heartbroken, and I was going to see it through. The OPP arrived at 7:20 inches the morning. 2 vehicles. Plainclothes investigators. Constable Yip was one of them. Simultaneous arrest, she told me. His home and the property here. I stayed back, watched from the porch. They came out of the barn. Curtis had apparently let himself in at some point before they arrived. I don't know why. Maybe something in there he thought he needed. And when the investigators met him coming around the corner of the building, I saw his face. First, confusion. Then, understanding. Then nothing. A blankness that was worse than either. They brought him past the truck. He looked at the wheel well where the tracker had been. He looked at me. "Dad," he said. "Dad, you need to understand. You weren't coping. You couldn't see it, but you weren't managing. We were trying to protect you. The things we tell ourselves." I said, "I built this property with your mother when you were 3 years old. I have maintained it alone for 6 years. I have never missed a mortgage payment, a tax deadline, or a single Saturday morning at the farmer's market. I do not need protection, Curtis. I needed a son." He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved across his face. I don't know if it was shame or anger or something else. Then, they put him in the vehicle. Heather was arrested at their apartment in Guelph. I wasn't there for that. Beverly told me later that she'd apparently tried to access the Thornfield account remotely on her phone while the investigators were at the door. It didn't help her case. The investigation took 8 months to fully complete. Beverly traced every dollar. $139,000 had been moved through Thornfield and into that credit union account. $22,000 had already been spent a truck, a vacation to Portugal that Curtis had posted about on social media while I was eating alone at my kitchen table. The forged power of attorney was the most serious charge. Document examination confirmed it wasn't my signature. The handwriting analysis report ran to 40 pages. The Crown prosecutor told me they had rarely seen elder financial abuse cases this thoroughly documented. She said it in a way that I think was meant as a compliment. I told her I'd had good help. Curtis pled not guilty. He changed the plea 4 weeks before trial. He received 3.5 years. Heather received 2 years less a day, which meant provincial rather than federal custody. Both of them surrendered their professional credentials. Curtis had held a petroleum engineering license. Heather, her pharmaceutical sales certification. Their apartment was seized and applied to restitution. I recovered $94,000 of the $139,000. The $45,000 gap is something I think about sometimes. Not because I can't absorb it financially, because it represents a year of my son's planning, of his sitting across from me at dinner, of his hugging me in the driveway and saying, "I love you, Dad," and meaning the opposite of what a person is supposed to mean when they say that. Before sentencing, Curtis's lawyer asked if he could speak with me privately. I said no. Some people have asked me since then whether I feel guilty, whether I wish I'd handled it differently, whether there was something I missed that might have told me earlier. I've thought about it honestly. What I know is this. Curtis, as an adult, made a series of choices over a period of more than a year. He recruited his partner. He installed a tracking device. He forged my signature. He opened shell companies. He booked a clinic appointment to have me declared incompetent. These were not impulsive acts. These were decisions, made carefully, over time. I didn't cause that. I couldn't have prevented it by being a different kind of father, or a more attentive one, or a warmer one. Whatever shaped him into a person capable of this, it wasn't something I did in the last 6 years. That's not denial. That's just the conclusion I've reached after a lot of late nights thinking it through. My daughter. I have a daughter. I haven't mentioned her. She lives in Halifax and works in marine biology and calls me every Sunday and visited twice during the investigation without knowing any of it was happening. My daughter came up for a week after the trial. We didn't talk about Curtis much. We walked the property, checked on the apple trees, sat on the porch in the evenings. On her last night, she said, "Dad, I want you to know that if you ever need anything, you call me." "I know," I said. "I mean it," she said. "I'm not saying it to say it." I looked at her. She had her mother's way of making you feel like the most important person in the room without trying. "I know you mean it," I said. She flew home on a Monday. I stood in the driveway watching the car to the airport until it disappeared over the hill. Then I went back inside and changed the passwords on everything. Every account, every device, every lock on the property. Not out of fear, just because it was time. I still drive to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings. I still work in the shop 3 or 4 days a week. I've been building a blanket chest from some black walnut I've been drying for 2 years. Lorraine always wanted one. I do my own vehicle maintenance. I manage my own accounts. I file my own taxes. I am 69 years old. I have all my faculties and a full calendar and more to do than I have hours in the day, most weeks. If you're watching this and something feels wrong, not just family, but anything, trust that feeling. You've earned the right to trust your own instincts. Document what you see. Tell someone you trust who is not inside the situation. Contact the authorities before you confront anyone directly. The confrontation impulse is natural, but it's almost always the wrong move. The GPS tracker is in an evidence locker somewhere in Wellington County. The barn is still mine. The apple trees came in well this year, the best in several seasons, actually. Lorraine would have made a pie. I made two. Where are you watching this from? What time is it there right now? And have you ever had to fight for something that should never have been threatened in the first place? Tell me in the comments. Every story is worth hearing. If this reached you, if it meant something, please subscribe to Lullaby Revenge. We're here every week with true stories about love, about loss, about the moments that test who you actually are. Because surviving isn't the whole story. What you do after that's the part that matters. Thank you for listening. Stay sharp, and never let anyone convince you that your age is a reason to hand over your life. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. Not just the legal outcome, the sentencing, the restitution, the forfeited apartment, but the part that doesn't make it into court records. The part that happens at 2 in the morning when you're lying awake in a house that feels both familiar and permanently changed. What I keep coming back to is this. Curtis didn't stumble into what he did. He planned it. He recruited Heather. He installed the tracker, opened the shell company, forged my name, booked the clinic appointment. Each step followed the last with a logic that took months to construct. And the thing about a plan that deliberate is that it carries its own consequence, not as punishment handed down from somewhere above. I don't think about it that way, but as a simple mechanical truth. When you build something dishonest that carefully, you leave that much more evidence behind. The more elaborate the scheme, the more threads exist to pull. Beverly pulled every one of them. I think about the version of this where I reacted the moment I found that tracker, where I called Curtis in a fury and confronted him in my driveway. He would have denied it. Heather would have backed him up. The tracker would have disappeared. The Thornfield account would have been emptied or closed, and I'd have been left with nothing but my own anger and a story no one could verify. The intelligence I'm most grateful for isn't anything I learned in 34 years of claims work. It's the discipline to do nothing when everything in you wants to do something. That's harder than it sounds. It gets harder the closer the betrayal is to home. There's something I want to say about age, because it's at the center of what Curtis and Heather were counting on. They were counting on the assumption that a man in his late 60s would be easy to confuse, easy to redirect, easy to convince he was no longer capable of managing his own affairs. That assumption is not unique to them. It's everywhere. It shows up in the way certain people raise their voices slightly when talking to someone with gray hair. It shows up in the well-meaning suggestions to downsize, to simplify, to let someone else handle the complicated parts. And sometimes those suggestions come from a genuine place. But sometimes they come from people who have decided your competence is an inconvenience to their plans. I was not confused. I was not declining. I was a retired fraud investigator with 34 years of experience who noticed that the weight of his smoke detector was wrong, that a GPS tracker had been placed on his vehicle, and who responded to that discovery, not with panic, but with method. The irony is that the very skills Curtis and Heather were trying to argue I'd lost were the skills that dismantled everything they built. What I'd tell anyone watching this, and I mean anyone, regardless of age, is that your instincts are data. When something feels off, that feeling is your experience talking. Don't explain it away to make someone else comfortable. Write it down. Protect yourself before you confront anyone. And find one person outside the situation you can trust completely, because isolation is the first tool every scheme like this depends on. Lorraine used to say that character is just what you do when no one's looking. I believed her then. I believe her more now. Curtis had every opportunity to be a different person. So did Heather. The choices they made in private, over months, are theirs to carry. What I carry is the farm, and the wood shop, and the apple trees, and my daughter's voice, every Sunday on the phone. That's more than enough.